Gender. One of the main challenges of talking about gender in our current context is that there are multiple and contradictory definitions of the word on offer. Is gender just a synonym for sex? Is gender a social construct? Is gender an innate sense of oneself? Right? So people are using this same term, but with wildly different meanings. And so we're just talking past each other constantly. So in this brief talk, I hope to do two things. First, I want to provide a kind of orientation to the confusing and conflicted gender landscape by introducing you to the two dominant theories, as I see it, about gender in our contemporary moment. And then secondly, I hope to illuminate how a Catholic view compares with those two theories, namely in the understanding of sexual difference as both a natural and sacramental reality. So, let's begin by looking at the social constructionist understanding of gender, a theory which emerged in the 20th century and was, until quite recently, the predominant view in the world of secular gender studies. I often start the genealogy of this theory basically right where Bishop Barron left off in his lecture last night. He stopped at Sartre, and I'm going to pick up with Simone de Beauvoir, who was a contemporary of Sartre, actually more than a contemporary of Sartre, if you know what I mean. So Simone de Beauvoir was a French philosopher, and she wrote the book called The Second Sex. So it might seem strange that I'm starting with her, considering that she doesn't actually use the term gender, but she does in that book introduce the term that gender would soon come to name. Hold on, let me flip over. Here it is. That concept is expressed in this well-known line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." So that statement is really the mustard seed of constructionist gender theory. When de Beauvoir writes that one is not born, but becomes a woman, she's driving a wedge between the idea of woman and the idea of female. She's arguing that woman is a social and cultural fabrication that is kind of layered onto the biological reality of femaleness. Now, second wave feminists, in particular, latched onto this distinction between sex and gender. So instead of relying simply on sex to classify men and women, they imported the term gender in order to distinguish between sex as a basic biological reality and gender as this kind of collection of socially constructed norms and ideals that are associated with each sex and then mistakenly read as natural. So that's the classic sex-gender split, right? The second wave feminist understanding of sex and gender that I inherited when I studies over about 20 years ago. So sex refers to biology and gender refers to the social and cultural meanings attached to sex. So feminists saw this concept of gender as providing a site of resistance to essentialism, which in feminist studies is the very basic claim that men and women are innately different, that they differ at the level of nature. And one can understand why this distinction had some utility, right? So at times, differences between the sexes have been translated into rigid sex-specific roles, too often creating a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority in favor of men. There are culturally bound assumptions about women that have been too easily naturalized and seen as innate and inevitable, rather than distortions of culture. So an easy example might be kind of the assumption that women aren't as rational or intellectually capable as men and therefore should not be as highly educated, right? So we can see that, as a distortion of culture rather than something that is strictly natural. So feminists saw this concept of gender as a helpful tool that could enable them to better articulate the difference between what is cultural and what is innate. However, in the late 1980s, this neat sex-gender distinction began to unravel, thanks in large part to the work of Judith Butler, who's really the godmother of constructionist gender theory. So Butler really ups the ante of social constructionism. She asserts that biological sex itself is a social fabrication, a construct. Writing, female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman. So Butler leans into many of the ideas asserted by Simone de Beauvoir, taking them to new extremes. Near the end of the second sex, Simone de Beauvoir writes, "Nothing is natural." And for Butler, that statement is a foundational premise. So the idea that humankind is characterized by two sexes that are biologically complementary is, for her, a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. So Butler's early philosophy can rightly be described as anti-realist. Truth is suspended in air quotes as ultimately unknowable or non-existent. And what remains is power. Knowledge, then, is not a matter of discerning or recognizing what is true, because truth itself is a construction of power. So gender theory in this mode is radically constructionist. It rejects the idea that sex or gender or female, man, woman, any of those terms name something real. Instead, those concepts are seen as social constructs that create the illusion of something real. Once this distance between bodily sex and identity was enabled via the concept of gender in the mid-20th century, it did not take long, merely a few decades, for gender to shift meanings once again, becoming entirely disconnected from sex. And this disconnection paved the way for an even more fragmented understanding of the human person to emerge, a theory that is centered on a subjective understanding of gender or gender identity. So what is this theory, and how does it compare to constructionist gender theory? So according to this theory, one's identity as a man or woman, or both, or neither, is based solely on subjective self-perception. So this theory separates gender, manness, womanness, from biological sex, rooting sexed identity, actually itself, in self-perception rather than the body. Right, so you can see this in the infograph up here, the gender unicorn, which you may have seen. It's very commonly circulated in educational settings. But I think it's a kind of perfect distillation of gender identity theory or gender subjectivism. So you can see that the thought bubble with the rainbow in it, right, that is the location, the ground of gender and even sex in this theory. And in cases where there's a felt incongruence between one's gender identity and one's biological sex, this model affirms that thought cloud, right, over the objective organization of the body. Now, in order for this theory to seem plausible, right, in order for us to be convinced that female is a feeling, we have to unlearn the obvious and intuitive truth that the human species has two sexes, male and female. And this unlearning is being facilitated in large part by the manipulation of language. Right, so take the phrase sex assigned at birth. That's really standard HR terminology these days. The word assigned here is philosophically loaded. It conveys the idea that biological sex is something that is imposed by a physician at birth, rather than an objective fact that is recognized and recorded. The phrase assigned at birth has an interesting history. It was first used only in reference to very complex congenital disorders of sexual development that at times result in apparent sexual ambiguity at birth. So in these extremely rare cases, doctors would sometimes initially assign a sex. They would kind of guess what might be most likely to emerge in the sexual development process, because the maleness or femaleness of the baby might not be readily apparent at birth, right? So in those cases, they might initially assign a sex. But in gender subjectivism, that terminology is now used in reference to all births, as if every human being is born sexually ambiguous. And this opens the way for sexed categories like male and female to be redirected from the objective organization of the body to that subjective sense of self. Now, some of you smart cookies out there might already be picking up on an interesting paradox here. The idea that gender is purely a social construct, something that is imposed upon us by society, is markedly different from the idea that gender is a real, innate, immutable identity that one accesses through self-perception. In fact, I would argue that those are two contradictory ideas. On the one hand, constructionist theory, gender is something extrinsic, external to the self, right? It exists in culture. It's also artificial, right? It's not real or strictly real. It's a construct. And it's also oppressive, right? In constructionist gender theory, gender is kind of a drag, right? Like, well, that's an unintended pun. It's literally a drag. Gender is a drag, and it's an oppressive one, right? And we should undermine gender as much as we can, break free from it, right? And then on the other side, in the subjectivist understanding, gender is intrinsic. It's deep. It's in the inner self. It's deeply authentic. It is real. It is who you really are. And it is liberating. It's good. It's something you should realize about yourself and then express to the world, right? Now, how do those ideas cohere? Of course, you could argue, let's try to strongman this. You could say that we internalize social constructs and they become something like innate identities, right? But that's not what proponents of gender subjectivism argue, because they also argue that gender is a truth so profound that you realize it at a very young age, very early in the socialization process. And in fact, that inner truth might be at odds with your socialization as a girl or a boy, right? A male child who's being socialized as a boy asserts that he's a girl, that's real, right? It's actually at odds with his socialization, okay? So there's really tension between these two theories. And for the subjectivist, if there's any incongruence between the body and this asserted sense of gender, then it's the body that must be changed and brought into alignment with the inner truth of gender. So in gender subjectivism, it's the self-concept that is real and mutable, but the body is malleable. The body might be a lie. So these are really two different theories of gender that are deeply in tension. So how did we get from one theory to the other if they're so different, right? Where they seem so contradictory. Constructionism is anti-essentialist, whereas subjectivism is making realist, essentialist claims about gender, right? She is a girl trapped in a boy's body. Trans women are women, right? Those are realist, essentialist claims. Well, I think there's a reification turn happening here. So to reify means to make real. The radical social constructionism of Butler dethroned the reality of sexual difference, not in fact, but in our perception, our cultural imagination. And this anti-realism cleared the way for a new realism to emerge, one not based on the objective, intelligible, sensible world, but on one's subjective sense of self. So we're seeing two moves in this unfolding conceptual revolution. First, deconstruction, and then reification. So first, what is taken to be real, sex as immutable, is dismantled through constructionist gender theory. And then in its place, a reconfigured understanding of reality is asserted. So that, I think, is how we get from gender as a social construct to gender is an innate sense of self independent of socialization. Now, interestingly, this actually brings us to a bewildering reversal of the sex-gender split from second-wave feminism, right? In which sex was the fact and gender the construct. Well, now, sex is the construct, but gender, qua subjective sense of self, is what's real. Another layer of confusion here, as if this isn't enough, is that there has not been a clean break between these two theories, right? Between constructionism and subjectivism. Instead, both definitions of gender are routinely offered in contemporary discourse, sometimes by the same person, sometimes in the same sentence. There's an almost constant equivocation about what exactly gender is. One of my favorite examples of this are the Associated Press style guidelines released, I think, in the last couple of years. Guidelines for writing about gender issues. So these are just screenshots. So on the one hand, we have a definition of gender, which is a social construct encompassing a person's behaviors, intrinsic identity, and appearance, right? So this is kind of like a valiant attempt to kind of just shove it all into one definition, right? So it's both a social construct and somehow an intrinsic, which means pre-social identity. And then if that's not confusing enough, there's another definition later on in the style book with gender identity. We have a person's sense of feeling male, female, neither, or some combination of both, right? So this is the gender subjectivism. Often just gender will suffice. Okay, so already we have an affirmation both of gender as a social construct and gender as a subjective sense of self. So good luck, journalists, with that. So that's where we are, in a cultural moment where both gender constructionism and gender subjectivism are in the water, with the latter, with gender subjectivism, arguably now eclipsing constructionism. In fact, in Butler's latest book that Holly mentioned I reviewed recently, Butler tempers many of her constructionist claims. She essentially disavows her earlier work in order to accommodate gender subjectivism, right, which is pretty amazing. Okay. Now, both of these theories offer some partial truths. It is true that there are cultural expressions of sexual difference that are not strictly biological, all right, but are rather constructs of culture, and they vary across cultures and throughout history. Some of these are beautiful, some are benign, some are harmful, right? We think of female genital mutilation, right, as an example. So being able to make a distinction between nature and culture is helpful and important, right? So that is something that constructionism is showing us. Similarly, there's a partial truth in subjectivist gender theory. It's getting at something true about human beings. We experience our sexed identity differently than other animals, right? Because we are self-aware, rational, reflective, spiritual beings. There is a rich subjective interiority to being a sexed human being. I can contemplate the meaning of my own womanhood. I probably have done that too much, like more than people should do. But I contemplate the meaning of my own womanhood more than, I'm sure my cat never kind of like lays around wondering like, what does it mean to be a female cat, So there is something true about subjectivist gender theory. In fact, John Paul II's personalist philosophy places great importance on the subjective dimension of being human. But he does not overlook or deny the objective reality of our nature. And this is what both of these theories do in their purest forms. They take what is an aspect of our personhood and make it absolute. Now, the shared lie or error on which they depend is this: the deconstruction of sexual difference, a rejection of the intrinsic meaning and dignity of the sexed body. And it is this, the obfuscation of sexual difference, that is the major point of departure between a Catholic understanding of gender and contemporary gender theories. The Catholic understanding of gender is grounded in both reason and revelation. And in this view, in this way of seeing, gender is both a natural reality, something we can observe and understand through reason, and it is also a sacramental reality. It carries sacred significance, which we apprehend through the light of revelation. First, let's look at gender as a natural reality. The etymological root of the word gender is gens. It's a root that you can see also in words like generation, genealogy, genesis. In the verb form, gens refers to begetting. In the noun form, it signifies offspring or kin. The root meaning of gender, then, is connected to generativity. It names the reality that there are two kinds of humans necessary for generation, the male and the female. There is not, then, in the Catholic view, a separation between sex and gender. This is important, okay? Now, I'm not saying here that we can't have room, again, to critique certain cultural expressions of how sexual difference manifests in the world, right? We can make meaningful distinctions between what is natural and what is cultural. But we can't separate sex and gender. Separating sex and gender, or to put it differently, separating woman from female, man from male, this undermines the fundamental unity of the human person. So for our purposes today, since I'm now kind of speaking in a Catholic mode, I'm going to be using the terms gender and sex more or less interchangeably. Like most normal people intuitively do. So in order to understand gender as a natural reality, we have to understand what sexual difference is in human beings specifically. As I mentioned earlier, much of the confusion and equivocation about gender in our time depends upon obfuscating the reality of sex, presenting sex as some ambiguous, spectrum, scalar phenomenon that is so complex and mysterious that we just can't make objective judgments about it. Friends, this is bollocks. Sex is quite simple to define in human beings and can be easily identified. So sex refers to the organization of the body according to generative potential. And the definitions Aristotle gave us over 2,000 years ago still hold true. So a woman is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate within herself. And a man is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate outside of himself. So this definition still holds true, but it's important in our time to respond and see how it holds up to two common objections. The first one is infertility. What about infertility? How can we define men and women according to generativity when there are people who are infertile? This is a very understandable objection, one I would have once made myself. How is it acceptable to define men and women by generative potential given that not everyone is fertile and no one, in fact, is always fertile? The answer to this objection depends upon the meaning of the word potential. So I'm using that term in a technical and philosophical way. By potential, I mean an inherent capacity that exists regardless of whether or not it is ever actualized. Okay. So every female human being has the innate potential to generate life within, in that her entire physiology is organized according to that potential. Now, there are, of course, conditions that prevent that potential from resulting in an actual pregnancy, from being actualized. And those instances are often a profound source of pain, precisely because there is a telos to the body that is being thwarted. We don't say, oh, a man can't get pregnant, he's infertile, right? Because he doesn't have that innate potential, as I'm defining it, as a woman does. So even the category of infertility gestures back to the distinctive procreative capacities of each sex. So rather than an argument against my definition, the case of the infertile man or woman reaffirms the definition that I've provided. But what about intersex conditions? This is by far the most common objection I hear. Sex is not binary because intersex people exist. The term intersex is often used in a way to suggest that it refers to something completely outside the male-female binary, as if there's a third sex or a non-sexed category of persons who are neither male or female, or somehow both male and female. So used in this way, or misused, I would say in this way, the intersex card can be played to justify the idea that, kind of the constructionist idea, that the sex binary is a construct, and then we can kind of open the door to subjectivism, to self-identification. So let me briefly clarify, this is a very complex issue, but I'm going to briefly clarify what intersex conditions are and what they are not. So the term intersex is a canopy term, okay? It refers to a range of over a dozen different conditions that affect the sexual reproductive system in some way. And the term used by the medical establishment is disorders of sexual development, or DSDs. These are objectively diagnosable and physiological conditions. They refer to something that is atypical about the body. They are best understood as variations within the category of male and female rather than exemptions from them. And in fact, many DSDs are sex-specific. Klinefelter syndrome, for example, only affects males. So how common are intersex conditions, or DSDs? There's this oft-quoted stat out there that greatly exaggerates the prevalence of DSDs, claiming that 1.7% of people are intersex, as many as have red hair. Now, this stat comes from the work of biologist Anne Fausto Sterling, who I first studied about 20 years ago in graduate school, before actually intersex was very much in the public imagination. And her work is very influenced by constructionist gender theory. So she gets this number by defining as intersex any deviation from, quote, the Platonic ideal of male and female. I think there's a lot of intersex people in this room, I'm just gonna say. It's such a capacious definition, right? That would include, just to give one example, that would include women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? Because they have atypically high levels of testosterone, right? Suddenly she's defining women who are unambiguously female as intersex, right? So the definition is just overly capacious. While the term intersex, and also the term intersex is used to imply sexual ambiguity, right? But in reality, and this is important, the vast majority of people with intersex conditions are unambiguously male or female. Complex DSDs, like the ones I mentioned earlier, that result in apparent sexual ambiguity at birth, are extremely rare, occurring only in 0.018% of live births. So to flip the stat, that means that 99.982% of the time, sex is unambiguous and readily recognizable at birth. That actually kind of shocks me, honestly, how stable the binary is, considering how complex sexual development is and how easily it would be for things to go awry. So sex is not a spectrum, but a remarkably stable binary. So from the vantage point of reason, we can understand gender as a natural reality, one that is bodily, one that is visible, right? We can identify it by seeing the body and the arrangement of the body. And it's grounded again in generative potential. But that's not all. In the Catholic understanding, gender is not merely a natural reality, but it is also a sacramental one. And this, my friends, is why I love being Catholic. As a Catholic, I get to absorb all that reason and science can tell me about sexual difference and the body. I can observe and explore the order and beauty and complexity of our nature. But I also know that there's a higher order of beauty and complexity of which nature is only a sign. However wonderful the natural world is, it is not absolute. It is not self-creating and self-sustaining. Its beauty and order carry a greater signifying meaning. Nature points beyond itself to the things of God. What I'm describing here is the sacramental principle, which in its most basic form holds that the visible reveals the invisible. The visible world of nature reveals and mediates the hidden realities of God. Material realities are windows into the divine. And this is no less true. In fact, I would argue it's more true of sexual difference itself. The world, even and especially our bodies, are sacred signs, icons that reveal the reality of a loving God, a God who is seeking to make himself known. So what then is the sacred meaning of sexual difference? Well, I will only be able to kind of brush the surface of this today. But what does it reveal? Clearly, it holds profound temporal significance as the sole means by which human beings come into existence. Right? It's not human beings don't create sexual difference, it's the other way around. But this earthly meaning points to a deeper spiritual meaning. Sexual difference is an integral part of how we image God. In his series of homilies known as the Theology of the Body, John Paul II writes that the human being, quote, appears in the visible world as the highest expression of the divine gift. All right, and just FYI, he's using man here in a generic sense, meaning the human person, both male and female. So according to John Paul II, the very sacramentality of creation, the sacramentality of the world, is revealed in the human person created in the image of God. And moreover, he writes, it is through our bodiliness, our masculinity and femininity, that the human person becomes a visible sign of the economy of truth and love, which has its source in God himself. Gender, then, is a visible sign of the divine economy of truth and love. John Paul II is drawing deeply here from the Genesis creation accounts, right, which are these rich symbolic narratives that show us where we're from in order to show us who we are. and what we're made for. And these accounts depict a dynamic between God and creation that is characterized by gift. A dynamic that carries throughout the Old Covenant and the New Covenant in Scripture, culminating in the incarnation and Christ's sacrifice of love on the cross. God is the ultimate giver, the generous source of being, and our ultimate calling is to just say yes to that gift. This dynamic of gift is etched into our very nature as men and women. As John Paul II puts it, sexual difference is, quote, the original sign of a creative donation. Thus, he writes, there is a strong link between the mystery of creation as a gift that springs forth from love and our existence as male and female. So let me try to paraphrase a little bit what he's saying here, okay? My female body visibly signals the capacity for motherhood. Yet that capacity on its own is dormant, right? It can only be actualized by male generative potential and vice versa. So our distinctive generative powers to become fruitful require the generosity and receptivity of the other. We receive the generative potential of the other as we give of our own generativity. Thus, man and woman with our co-generative powers have the unique capacity to form an interpersonal communion that can bring forth new life. That is an image, a reflection of the divine. The Christian understanding of God as Trinity is that God is an interpersonal communion who is life-giving. So through our sexual differentiation, we image the triune God in a profound way. The sexes are, as John Paul II puts it, a primordial sacrament of the divine economy of gift. This generative meaning of the body is an aspect of the body's nuptial meaning. Generation, of course, is brought about by a bodily union between two persons. And not just any two will do, right? We need sexually differentiated persons. So a generative union is made possible by our sexual complementarity, maleness and femaleness, this bodily difference that is ordered toward the other. Gender is thus also a sign of the nuptial character of divine human communion. All throughout Scripture, God's relationship with humankind is depicted as nuptial, initially in the covenant with Israel, and then culminating in the union of Christ and the church. This is yet another way that sexual difference carries a higher iconic meaning. These are not mere symbols, empty and arbitrary, but on the contrary, reveal something profound about ultimate reality, about our true destiny, which is union with God. Gender, then, is part of God's self-revelation. It's part of his self-disclosure through the visible world. That is the Catholic view. Both of the secular theories of gender that I discussed earlier distort this view. The subjectivist distortion, right? Gender as subjective, and thus an invisible reality. This disrupts the sacramental dynamic. It erases it altogether, right? It erases the body's visible sacramental meaning. And if gender is only a construct, well, it tells us nothing about the things of God. It's merely a human projection, a funhouse mirror of human fantasies and anxieties that reveals nothing of the divine. The truth, my friends, is so much better. We are living icons. You, yes, you are a living icon, all of you. My beloved sister, who is in the throes of postpartum change, who can't look at herself in the mirror, you are a living icon. Sorry, I don't know, it's so beautiful, it makes me cry. My beloved brother, who feels intense distress about being male, you are a loving icon. Even infants in the womb, you're little icons. Brothers and sisters who are ravaged by disease or illness or age or injury, you still, in your very being, reveal the things of God. And that is the truth about gender, the beautiful truth that our faith gives us. And it's a truth that we have to cultivate in our hearts and carry into the world with boldness and delight. Thank you.